Imagine murdering two children for a crown, then trying to marry their sister, your own niece. Now imagine your enemies strip your body naked, stab your buttocks repeatedly, and throw you in an unmarked grave like garbage. In 2012, they found him under a parking lot, spine curved, skull cracked open, 9 fatal wounds to the head. This is the true story of Richard III, the king who disappeared 2 innocent boys from history and paid for it with one of the most brutal deaths ever recorded. And I'm about to show you evidence that's been hidden for 5 centuries. Before we dive into the scandalous life of one of England's most hated kings, let me set the scene. It's 1483, England is in chaos. The king just died, leaving behind 2 young sons. And their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is about to make a power grab that would shock the medieval world and leave a stain on history that persists 500 years later. This is the story of Richard III, usurper, possible child murderer, and a man whose sex life raised eyebrows, even in the morally flexible world of medieval royalty. Let's start with something the history books don't always highlight. Richard III had an active sex life before marriage, and we know this because of the evidence he couldn't hide: his illegitimate children. Meet John of Gloucester and Catherine Plantagenet. These 2 were Richard's bastard children, born before his marriage. Now, having illegitimate kids wasn't exactly scandalous for medieval nobility. It was almost expected. Kings and lords had mistresses, and nobody really batted an eye. But here's where it gets interesting. Richard acknowledged these children publicly and actually gave them positions at court. John of Gloucester was made captain of Calais, a prestigious military position. Richard clearly cared about his bastard son, which tells us something about his character. But who were the mothers? That's where the mystery deepens. Historical records are frustratingly silent about the identities of these women. Some historians speculate there may have been multiple mistresses before his marriage. One popular theory suggests Catherine's mother might have been Catherine Haute, but it's never been proven. What makes this particularly dark is what happened to John of Gloucester later. After Richard died at Bosworth Field, the Tudor regime had the young man executed in 1409, likely seeing him as a potential threat to Henry VI's throne. The son paid for the father's ambitions. In 1472, Richard married Anne Neville, and this is where things get politically complicated. Anne was the younger daughter of Warwick the Kingmaker, one of the most powerful men in England. She had previously been married to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian prince who died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Now there's a dark rumor that swirls around this marriage. Some contemporary sources suggested Richard may have been involved in Edward of Westminster's death at Tewkesbury, which would mean he potentially killed Anne's first husband to marry her. While most historians doubt this, it shows how Richard's reputation was already toxic even during his lifetime. The marriage produced one son, Edward of Middleham, but tragedy struck when the boy died in 1484 at around age 10. Contemporary accounts say both Richard and Anne were devastated. One chronicler wrote they were almost out of their minds with grief. Anne herself died less than a year later, in March 1485, possibly from tuberculosis, though some whispered poison. If you're loving this dark dive into history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're about to get into the really disturbing stuff. Now we get to the incident that defines Richard III's legacy, the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. When King Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, he left behind 2 sons, 12-year-old Edward V and 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. As their uncle, Richard was named Lord Protector and was supposed to safeguard them until Edward V came of age. Instead, within 3 months, Richard had declared both boys illegitimate, seized the throne for himself, and had them locked in the Tower of London. And then they vanished. The last recorded sighting of the princes was in the summer of 1483. They were seen playing in the Tower Gardens. And then, nothing. They were never seen again. No official announcement of their deaths, no burial, no explanation. Just gone. The accusations started immediately. Sir Thomas More, writing decades later, claimed Richard had them smothered with pillows in their beds. Other accounts suggested they were drowned or stabbed. In 1674, workmen at the Tower of London discovered a wooden box containing two small skeletons buried beneath a staircase. Were these the princes? DNA testing in the 1930s suggested they were two boys aged around 10 and 12, but the results were inconclusive, and the royal family has refused further testing. Did Richard III murder his own nephews? We'll never know for certain, but he had the motive. They were the only thing standing between him and the crown. He had the means, they were in his custody, and he had the opportunity. They disappeared on his watch. The circumstantial evidence is damning. If murdering your nephews wasn't dark enough, there's another scandal that rocked Richard's short reign. The rumor that he wanted to marry his own niece. After Anne Neville died in March 1485, whispers began circulating that Richard was planning to marry Elizabeth of York, his niece, the daughter of his dead brother, Edward IV, and sister to the two missing princes. This would have been considered incestuous by medieval standards, and it caused such a scandal that Richard was forced to publicly deny it. At a council meeting at St. John's Priory in Clerkenwell, Richard stood before his lords and bishops and swore he had never intended to marry Elizabeth. But here's the thing, he wouldn't have needed to make such a public denial unless the rumor had serious traction. Why would he even consider this? Politics. Elizabeth of York had a strong claim to the throne. By marrying her, Richard could unite the York and Lancaster factions and strengthen his position. But it was also deeply cynical. This was the sister of the boys he'd allegedly murdered. Some historians believe the rumor was Tudor propaganda designed to make Richard look monstrous. Others think there might have been some truth to it, showing just how desperate Richard had become to secure his throne. Now let's talk about Richard's body, because this adds another layer to his story. For centuries, Richard III was portrayed as a hunched, withered villain, partly thanks to Shakespeare's famous play. Tudor propaganda painted him as physically deformed, suggesting his twisted body reflected his twisted soul. When his skeleton was found in 2012, scientists discovered he did indeed have severe scoliosis, a curved spine. His right shoulder would have been noticeably higher than his left, and he likely stood shorter than his actual height. But he wasn't the poisonous bunchback toad of Shakespeare's imagination. He was a functioning warrior who fought in multiple battles. This matters because medieval people believed in physiognomy, the idea that physical appearance reflected moral character. Richard's enemies used his scoliosis as proof of his evil nature. It was disability discrimination weaponized for political propaganda. Richard III's death was as violent as his life. On August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard made a desperate cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor. He killed Henry's standard-bearer and came within feet of Henry himself before being surrounded and cut down. The forensic analysis of his skull is horrifying. He received at least 9 wounds to his head, including 2 that would have been instantly fatal. One was a massive blow from a halberd that sliced off part of his skull. Another was a sword thrust through the base of his skull into his brain. These wounds suggest he lost his helmet during the fighting and was hacked to death by multiple attackers. But it gets darker. His body also shows humiliation injuries, wounds inflicted after death. His buttocks were stabbed, likely as his naked corpse was slung over a horse for the journey back to Leicester. For 2 days, his body was displayed publicly so people could see the tyrant was dead. He was then buried in a crude grave at Greyfriars Church without ceremony, a shocking end for an anointed king. So was Richard III the monster of legend, or a man caught in impossible circumstances who made ruthless choices for survival? The truth is complicated. He almost certainly had the princes killed. He seized power through deception. He ruled with an iron fist for just 2 years. But he was also a capable administrator who introduced legal reforms and showed loyalty to his brother for years before claiming the throne. He loved his bastard children enough to elevate them. He grieved genuinely for his wife and son. He died fighting bravely rather than fleeing. Richard III remains one of history's most controversial figures, a king whose skeleton lay forgotten under a parking lot for 500 years, just as his true character lies somewhere between the propaganda and the apologists. What do you think? Was Richard III a misunderstood king or a cold-blooded murderer? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more dark history like this, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've got plenty more scandalous stories from the past waiting for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.